Hi, I'm Shawna.
And I'm Liz.
Welcome to Getting Bookish, a weekly podcast where we will talk about different book-related topics, let you know what we're reading, and even answer Q&As from you.
Be sure to visit our website, gettingbookish.com, and check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Getting Bookish. If you enjoy our podcast, we'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a rating and review, which helps us to be seen by other book lovers.
With all that said, we hope you'll enjoy Getting Bookish with us.
Enjoy the podcast.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us again on our podcast. And I have to open up with a book that I bought just yesterday at Barnes & Noble. And it was one of those where I was walking through the aisles and the cover just caught my eye. I've never heard of it. Those? Yes. They shout to me or sometimes whisper. They're like, Shawna, look at me. And so it was literally like that. Like I walked by it and I was like, whoa, hold on. Let me back up and look at that. So it was this beautiful cover, and it's called Dear George, Dear Mary. Have you seen this?
I haven't. It's about George Washington?
It is. It's a novel of George Washington's first love, and it's through his love letters and personal journals. So it says it's inspired by hundreds of letters, witness accounts, and journal entries from the 18th century with his relationship with his first love, Mary Eliza Phillipse, the richest belle in America. And it's in the 1700s, obviously. But it looks like such a sweet book, and I had to get it because he spoke in such a way that was almost poetic. And I'm really excited to read this. And I love the last portion in the dust jacket. It says, "This story is both sweeping and intimate as it asks, did unrequited love spark a flame that ignited a cause that became the American Revolution?"
Oh, that gives me chills a little bit.
Yes.
Historical books, they're so fun to read because you know a little bit going in.
Right. You know how it turned out.
Right.
But what I was also going to say about this when I was in Barnes & Noble, so I had this in my hand and there was a lady stocking books next to me, and I said, have you read this by any chance? And she said, oh, I actually have. And I said, oh my gosh, that's awesome. What did you think? What is it about? And she goes, it was good. And I said, okay, well, that doesn't sound too exciting. And I said, well, can you tell me a little bit more about it? And she goes, well, I think the information is on the cover.
Oh.
Yeah. So I was like, well, now I feel dumb because, yeah, I know that. You know what I mean? I can.
Right. That was information I could have come across on my own.
Yes, I can get the general information, but I always like hearing somebody's review that has read it because it's a little bit more personal. It's a different aspect, but she was just kind of like, well, it's there. So that kind of led me to think about maybe she's not one of those people that knows how to describe a book. And I'm one of those people. It's really hard for me to talk about a book because I feel like I might talk too much. I might give something away. I don't really know what points to hit. But I'm thinking, you're a librarian and you work in a bookstore. I'm sure you have knowledge to help me and help other people who might not know how to explain about a book.
And I think that there's some practice in there. I don't think that you walk in one day and you're like, I read this book and I know exactly how to talk about it. And it was really good and I'm excited and I know what I'm going to say to make someone else feel excited about it. And something that was really interesting working at the library is we had to learn to describe books without our personal biases coming through.
Oh, that would be hard for me.
It was very challenging sometimes. So I couldn't pick up a book and say, you have to read this. It's so good, because that's a personal bias.
Right.
So we had to do like a lot of summary. You have to read this because it's super exciting. I have read this before. I can't remember what it's about right now. I literally just grabbed a book off the pile over here. But I'd have to like summarize it and then say, if you like exciting books, if you like fantasy, like books with magic in them, you would like to read this book. But something that I love about my blog and now working at the bookstore is I get to say more of my opinion, which is really fun when talking about books, to say, oh, I loved this. This character is awesome. This part is really exciting. And you can talk more about your own personal feelings. Now, unless you're a librarian, you get to talk about your own personal feelings. So, so we'll talk about that a little bit. For me, whenever I'm talking about a book, I kind of go by like 3 basic rules. My most important rule, I actually blogged about a few weeks ago on our website, is no spoilers.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And for a lot of people, in their mind, they're like, oh, a spoiler is something that happens like to give away the ending. Giving away the ending is a spoiler. But for me, anything past like 50 pages in, that's a spoiler. That's too much information. I don't want to know, like,
because you're ruining the buildup.
Right. Like maybe on page 200 out of a 500-page book, these 2 characters kiss. Well, I don't want to know before it happens, even though usually you know it's coming. But I want that buildup, because that's what makes those plot points and subplot points more exciting, is that buildup to get there. And so I think that that's something that is challenging for people. And I always just cringe when someone like starts to be like, oh, you really like this book, like the craziest thing happens, and like they start to tell you like what they think is the craziest thing in the plot, and you're just like, why are you ruining it for me right now?
Yeah. You know what? Along with that, I think people also say things like, this is what I don't like when people say this. And I can't wait for an example. I'm trying to think. I can't wait to see what you think about Jane and Tom's relationship, because it's not going to happen what you think is going to happen.
Right.
And I'm like, well, now that I'm reading it, and if I think they're going to fall in love and move off together, you just told me that it's not going to happen what I think is going to happen. So you spoiled the book, even though you were trying to be, I don't know, in code.
And I think, and it's really, because it changes the way you read the book. If someone tells you it's not going to happen like you think it is, like that changes how you start to read the story. And so that's, when I'm telling someone about a book, I don't want to change how they would read it. But I do want to tell them why they should read it. That's kind of like my second point or rule. Was I calling these rules? Now I don't remember.
I think they're not
really rules. They are guidelines.
Yeah. Guidelines. Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yes. But so no spoilers, but I do want to tell someone why. Like, it's not just like the girl at Barnes and Noble. You don't want someone to be like, oh yeah, it's a good book, you should read it. Well, lots of books are good books. Yes. Why should I read it? I want to know, like, I want someone to hold up this book. Like, this book is The Boneless Mercies by April Genevieve. I think it's Tuchok is how you pronounce her last name. This book is amazing. And, like, someone could just give me a basic summary, or someone could tell me why I should read it. So I have sticky notes on the back because I wrote myself 2 ways. So here are my 2 ways. I could tell you that A group of young women have been trained to complete mercy killings for money, go on a quest to save a village from a monster. That's a summary. That's what the book is about. It makes the book sound good. Or I could say, girl power and female friendship reign supreme. This is an action-filled quest where girls face near constant ethical dilemmas where right and wrong are unclear. Will they win the battles? But what is the cost?
That almost sounds like two totally different books.
Right. And those were, I mean, they're both a description of the book, but I feel like the second one is why you would actually want to read this title.
Right.
Like, because it's about friendship and it's about this quest that they go on. But it's not just a quest. I mean, there's the whole book presents these ethical dilemmas, which is so interesting. And that's why I read it. That's why I picked it up to read it. And so I feel like the why is really important beyond like the summary, because it makes it just seem so much more exciting. And then the hardest thing when someone asks you about a book, and maybe this is what the girl was experiencing today, is when you don't like it. And someone's like, have you read this? And you can tell they're excited, like they already picked it up off the shelf. They're already a little invested into it. They probably want you to tell them this book was really good. But sometimes it isn't really good. And so when I have books and I blog, I usually write a book review on my blog for every book that I read. And oftentimes, not often, but probably a third of the time, it's a book that I didn't love. And so I like to keep my opinions light, especially if I'm in person.
Yes,
like
because you can tell a lot about a person's facial
yeah.
And their
if I had read
movements.
this and I was like, I'm not in it for like the girl friendship thing that's happening in this book. Like if I wasn't interested in that and someone came up and they're like, this looks so good, have you read it? I would probably give them like that first description. Like, well, here's what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, here's some basic summary. There are these girls, they perform mercy killings, and they go on a quest.
Yeah.
And that could be enough for someone. So if I'm talking to someone in person, I'm probably going to keep the negative reviews real light and happy.
Right. It's sometimes hard for me to do that, which is probably one of the reasons why God didn't intend for me to be a librarian, because there was a book that I recently read called Dar Matter by Blake Crouch, I think it was. And somebody asked me, did you like it? And I said, and right there, that tells...
pause is so telling.
That tells enough. And I thought... And I couldn't really say anything because I disliked it so much. I disliked it so much that it was hard for me to even think of something to say about. And so I just said, it got so many great reviews, so I wanted to try it, even though it might have been because it's way outside of anything that I would read. And so many people liked it. I just did not. And I think it was mostly because of the genre of the book. And I really think I just couldn't get into it.
Is it science fiction?
Yes. And he's in this he's trapped in this world where there's a lot of other hymns also.
Oh.
And they go in and out of these different... That's probably a spoiler, Liz. Because I... See how bad I am at this? Sorry, guys.
But I think that it takes practice. And something that you might be like, oh, wait, was that a spoiler? It might not actually be. like, again, for the Boneless Mercies, if you didn't read the jacket flap, and oftentimes I don't when I sit down to read a book, because I don't necessarily want to know what the publisher had to say. I would rather get a review from another person or...
just be surprised.
Yeah. And so if I hadn't read the jacket flap, like, you don't necessarily find that out immediately, or you don't really know what's going on immediately. Although I do think that happens in the first 50 pages. But I think, like with any skill, talking about books can be a skill, and it takes some practice to get it right, I guess.
Yes, so I will be honing my skills throughout these podcasts, because I am one of those people that finds it difficult to talk about a book. The other day, I can't remember if it was yesterday, a couple days ago, we were talking about Harry Potter. And you said, I mean, Harry Potter is so easy to describe, and you just blurted out this description. And I love Harry Potter, but when you said it's so easy to describe, I was sitting there like, that's so hard to describe. Like, and I'm wondering if I'm overthinking it, because there's so much in Harry Potter. I'm like, how do I, if somebody wants a description of a book in 3 to 5 sentences, how do you condense a story like that to make it sound so exciting that somebody wants to read it? How do you do that and still make it sound magical?
Well, I think that there are 2 basic descriptions, and we just kind of covered them, and I have another example. But there's what the book is about. Harry Potter is about a boy who finds out that he's a wizard and gets to go to a magical school. That's what the book is about.
Right.
But that's not what the book's really about.
Right. Yes, there's so much.
The book is so much more. So just like with the Boneless Mercies, it's about a group of women who go on a quest. But that's not what the book's really about.
Right.
Because, I mean, what makes a good book is usually that it's layered, that there's a lot going on. There's subplot, and there's, you know, all these interesting character dynamics. And that's what the book is really about. And I think that's why when we read something we love, we have such a hard time talking about it. Because the plot itself was great, but that's not what makes us love the book.
Yeah, that's very true. That makes so much sense, because I love Harry Potter, and it's hard for me to describe it because there's so many things that you could talk about of why it's so amazing.
Yeah.
But I do like how you broke it down. Obviously, don't give spoilers, and say why somebody should read it. Because I think that second question, why should somebody else read it? If you know the person you're talking to, you can relate it. If it's something you know, like I know you read a lot of fantasy or whatever, and you can relate it to something. I know you like the books that are these battles between good and evil. And this is like a classic tale of good versus evil.
Right. And because I think so much of the time when we're having those conversations with each other, we're learning about what the other person wants to read. So if I read a book and I'm describing it to you, I know what kinds of books you like to read. And so I'm probably going to hit on points, like automatically in my mind, I'm tailoring my review for you. Because I'm going to hit on points that I think you would be more interested in.
Like trigger words.
Right. But I think that it makes it more exciting. So I think when the challenge comes is when we review a book like in this setting, where we're reviewing it to an audience that we don't know.
Right.
Or when you're writing a book review to post somewhere. I mean, all these people are reading it. And so that's when it becomes more challenging. And for the first couple of years that I wrote reviews on my blog, I actually used a form.
Oh.
And the form went through, like, it was real basic things, and I just kind of filled it in because I wasn't even sure, even though I feel like I've been talking about books my whole life, this was a much more refined way to do it, so to speak, and I wanted to make sure I was covering specific things. So I gave it a rating, But then I would talk about the genre, and I would say who my favorite character was, and I would say if I felt like the book was plot-driven or character-driven. And then on my blog, if you go back and you read old ones, it's kind of funny because I always talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then I finished off with would I read more? And so in the good, I would talk about what are the parts that I really liked. In the bad, I would talk about what are the parts that I didn't really like. And then the ugly was more that description of what was this book really about, and did I like that part?
Oh, okay.
Like, did I like what this was really about?
So you would do the good, the bad, and the ugly even on books that you loved?
Yeah, sometimes it was a huge challenge to find something. And sometimes my answer was, I loved this book so much that I can't even think of something to say that would be negative. Sometimes like that would be my answer. But usually when you read a book, and I would try to read a book like with a critical eye,
Mm-hmm.
I would finish it and I'd be like, no, like the world building was weak. Like I loved the book, but I didn't really understand like what were the rules of magic in this world. That was never covered. Everybody just had magical powers. Like, you know, sometimes you want more. Maybe you want more character development. Maybe part of the plot wasn't, like they never went back to it. Like this thing happened and like a store exploded and you're like, well, what happened? We spent all that time talking about it in the book and then we never went back and talked about what it was. And so maybe there were plot holes or something. And so that's what I would try to cover in that part. And I would purposefully try to read more critically so that I could come up with something to write there. And if you're not writing reviews for, like, there's no reason to be like, okay, I have to think of a reason that I didn't like Six of Crows. There has to be a reason, like, what was in it that I didn't like? I mean, because that takes some of the pleasure out of it.
Right. Especially if it's not something that can come to you so easily. You don't want to sit there and dwell on it and find something if you truly loved everything about it.
Right. And so I think, you know, sometimes when you're writing specifically to review, you tend to be more critical or more aware of things that bother you than you would if you were really reading it just for pleasure, which is why you should be sitting down and reading a book. You should be reading it because you're excited to sit down.
So when you're making a review, you talked about ratings, and you rate on a 5-star.
Uh-huh.
What is it that takes you from that 4-star to the 5-star? What does a book do that can give that 5th star for you?
I've been trying to be stingier with my 5-star reviews.
Mm-hmm.
Something I struggle with is I finish a book and I'm like, this was the best book ever. And so I'm like, it's a 5-star book. I loved it. Well, no. So I think a 5-star book for me is when, like, I'm dying to read the next one. I go online and I look at fandom accounts. I want to get specialized bookmarks for my book. Like, that's when it's a 5-star review. Like, when I'm a little obsessed with it. And so I've had to be more specific about that because it used to be that almost if I enjoyed the book, it was a 5-star book.
Mm-hmm.
Like something had to be wrong with it to be a 4-star book. And now I've been trying to be a little pickier because I tend to, we talked about this when we talked about our favorite book, like the unanswerable question, and choosing a favorite book. It's hard for me to not be like, oh, well, I just finished it. It's my favorite book.
Right.
Because it's the one that's like right there in the forefront of my mind. And so when I want to be a little more, I don't know. I keep saying stingy, and I feel like there's probably a better word.
Well, I like how you said it's when you become obsessed and want the accessories, because That makes a lot of sense because I see behind you a whole bunch of Harry Potter memorabilia and collector's books, and maybe that's it too. When you want to buy, if there comes a collector's book, or if you buy it in a paperback and you want that hardback so that it can sit so pretty looking on your shelf.
Yeah, and I think now, after working at the library for so long, I didn't buy a lot of books for like 6 years because why buy them? I can just check them out from the library. Well, now that I'm not borrowing books from the library constantly, I want to flesh out my book collection a little bit more. And so I think those books that I'm like, oh, like I have to own that one. Those are my 5-star reviews. Those are the ones that are like 5 stars in my mind.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So I think sometimes, though, my favorite books to review are the books that I didn't like.
Oh, really? You like reviewing those ones?
I like reviewing the books that it's easy to write, like, I didn't like this and I didn't like this. And I think that probably came from a little bit of practice writing them, but they're a little bit more challenging to write. And sometimes they're just fun to sit down and write. And so one that I wrote this year was on the Bar Harbor retirement home. Have you
I haven't heard of that.
It has this great cover. There's like this really comfortable looking green chair, and behind it is like this beautiful library setting. And I was already very attracted to the cover, and a couple of people recommended it to me. I don't own it, so I can't show it to you, but I read it and I was disappointed.
Oh.
It didn't live up to this hype that they gave it. Like for them, it was a 5-star review. And so they were so excited to talk about it. And then when I read it, I was like, this is a 2-star book. Like, I'm just not enjoying this at all. But when I got to sit down and write my review, I got to identify why I didn't like it. I don't particularly like contemporary fiction. That's not my genre of choice. It's not my jam. If I wanted to read about real life, I would read the news, which I also avoid. So
that's why we read, so we can escape into these fun fantasy lands or like other time periods.
And so it was definitely like this huge step out of my comfort zone to read contemporary fiction. And then it was very, I was say it was plot based, but I don't think it was plot based. I think it was plotless.
Oh no.
and so it just wasn't my book.
Right.
And so I talked about why I didn't like it. I talked about who would probably like it, because obviously this book has a fan base. I had gotten 2 recommendations in like a 48-hour period of time to read this book. So that it has a fan base. And so I talked about those 2 things. I did not talk about like the author. I feel like sometimes you read a negative review and they're like, what kind of person writes a book like this? Or they'll say, what kind of person reads a book like this? And
what was the author thinking when they made this choice?
And the author doesn't want to read that. And there's just no reason for that unless you get to write book reviews for the New York Times. You just don't need to go there.
Right, unless you're a book critic.
Right. And I'm not a book critic. I'm just a book reviewer.
So you leave the author out of your reviews then. Is that what you're saying? You don't include what you think the author was trying to accomplish?
Sometimes I'll ask a question. Like I'll say, oh, I wonder why the author chose to do this. Or I wish the author would have like fleshed this character out more.
Okay.
But I don't think when you don't enjoy a book,
you don't shame the author.
I don't shame the author or anyone else who enjoys reading it. I don't want that to be my place. I want to bring happiness and sunshine into the world. I don't and I think there's a really beautiful way to write a negative review that doesn't go there.
Right.
And so I posted this book review, and the author liked it on Instagram. I know, which was like, I saw it and I was like, isn't that the author of the book that I just said I didn't like reading?
That's amazing.
And then they thanked me for the thoughtful review. And I was kind of like, even though it was a negative review, it was a thoughtful review.
Right. And it was respectful.
Right. And I was like, I'm glad that I could do that. That even though I didn't enjoy it, and I'm sure I was thinking a lot more negative things sometimes than what I wrote down out of frustration, because there are so many good books. When you're reading a book you aren't enjoying, put it down and walk away.
Right.
But for some reason, I was very dedicated to finishing this particular novel. And so I did. And I didn't enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed other books. Mm-hmm. But I think that by doing those three things, by identifying why I personally didn't like it, by not making it about the author, and by talking about who would like it, I was able to write a thoughtful review that still stated my opinion, and I wasn't holding back my opinion, but it didn't need to be scathing.
Right. Do you think sometimes books that you don't like are usually books that are not in your genre? Do you think that's one of the driving forces of that? Because I've noticed that with myself. I'm a little bit more critical of books that are not in a genre I typically read, and I'm a little bit more forgiving of books in the genre that I love. Not on purpose, but I'm just like, this is my genre, so it might not have been the best, but I love it. I don't know.
That makes me think of, so this week I read Daisy Jones and the Six, which has been everywhere. I feel like everyone is talking about
Everyone
this book
is talking about it. When I walked in Barnes & Noble, that was the first book that meets you when you walk in the store.
Right. And so I got it because I'm in Book of the Month Club, and so it was my choice this month because I'm trying to read things that are outside of my, my little reading comfort zone over here. And so this is, it takes place like in the late 70s. I would probably still consider that contemporary fiction, contemporary-ish. It seems like too recent to be considered historical fiction, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm just like, I don't think, like, late 70s, early 80s, that doesn't feel very historical to me. But so anyway, this is not a book that I would normally read the description of and pick up. And I think I approach them with fresh eyes, maybe. And so, because I think I do tend to be critical, like, of YA fantasy. I want you to hit all three of the areas of writing. I want it to have a great plot. I want it to have fantastic character development. And I want it to have great world building.
Okay, so you're you're more critical of your favorite genre.
I think I might be.
And that makes sense.
Because I've read so many, so they're easy to compare to each other. But this book is actually a little bit more difficult to talk about because I feel like I don't have as much language to talk about it. Because I'm so used to talking about fantasy books. I can talk about fantasy books all day long.
Right.
But this one, when I actually went and sat down to write my review, it took me a lot longer to write it. And so I think that that's another thing. When you're writing reviews, you get used to reviewing a certain kind of book.
Right. And you have that vocabulary.
Yes. And I didn't have that with this. Like, I had to really think about what it was about and then what it was really about.
Yeah.
So here's what Daisy Jones and the Six, if you've been living under a rock and haven't heard of this book
Yes, let's
yet.
hear your review after our schooling session just now.
Yes, so it's by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And so this is like my brief summary, what the book is about. A mythical band in the late 70s, their path to stardom through drugs, alcohol, marriage, affairs, and more.
Okay.
So that's what the book is about. Here's what the book is really about. Tragic, gritty, poignant. Daisy Jones is a girl who just needs someone to take her under their wing. Billy Dunn is the guy who always wants to do the right thing. Cast into a world of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, addiction runs rampant as they try to figure out their path through life and stardom.
That's good.
So that's what the book is really about.
Yeah.
And then in my review, I go on to talk about, like in my full review, I'm not going to read the whole thing right now, but you guys can find me on Goodreads and read it there. But,
what star rating would you give it?
I gave it 4 stars.
Oh, wow.
And, I mean, I didn't give it 5 stars because I don't read a lot of books like this that are gritty. I'm going to stick with that word as a descriptor. You know how, like, they just make you feel like shifting in your seat a little bit while you're reading them, like you're just a little uncomfortable. And that's how this book kind of made me feel, like, but the character development is amazing. In fact, the book itself reads so realistic that at first I thought it was like a real band that existed. And I actually had to look it up on Google.
I thought it was a real band until you just said a mythical band. And then I thought, oh, I thought this was like memoir-ish or something, but it's not.
And it absolutely reads like that. And in fact, I'm just going to open up a page and show you. So it almost reads like a script.
Oh, wow. I don't think I've ever read a book like that.
It was fascinating and very different. And so I read part of it here in the book, and then I listened to part of it, the audio, because the audio is full cast. So if you like audiobooks,
oh wow,
it's really amazing in the full cast. But it's different reading it and just reading the character's name each time. Whereas if you're listening, they don't say the name. You just have to kind of recognize the voice. So it was a little different reading versus listening. But if you're wanting something different, regardless of if you read contemporary fiction or whatever genre you read, if you're wanting to read something just a little different, this was a fun way to do that, because it was just, so there's never any description. There's never a description of a hotel room or because it's always just like that first person narrator talking about what happened.
Wow, that's a crazy concept. I wonder if it was hard to write like that, because it could turn out really bad.
Right. I could see it not going well. I haven't read anything else by her. Have you read anything?
I haven't heard of that author before.
When I went in and I was reading reviews after I wrote my review, it was really interesting because people were there. She has a massive fan base, and they were all like, "She did it again! She did it again! Like, fantastic book!" And I'm like, "Oh, that makes me want to go read other books of hers."
Yeah.
Because do they follow the same format?
Interesting.
And yeah. And so I think that when you're talking about a book that's different from what you normally read, sometimes it can be a challenge. So, I mean, I guess the moral of the story here is book reviews take practice. Practice makes perfect.
That was one of the reasons why when we were starting this podcast, I was like, I really want to talk about how to talk about books. And it just sparked that when I was at Barnes & Noble the other day, and she said, well, you could look at the jacket. First of all, that was a little rude. You work here. But I don't know if that was her intentions. She could have just been one of the people that just doesn't know how to describe a book to somebody that she doesn't know.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think that is also why my Goodreads is so sparse. If you go to Lizz's, it's going to be fantastic. If you go to mine, you're going to be sad. Because it's really hard. In fact, I think I've only written one review on Goodreads. The one that I wrote on Goodreads was a book that I didn't like. It was The Sugar Queen by Sarah Addison Allen. I think that's her name. She also wrote The Garden Spell. And everybody raved about this book. And it was, again, like you had said, I went in it with everybody just telling me how fantastic this book was. And I read it and I was waiting for the fantasticness to happen. And I think it was, what did you call it? Contemporary fiction? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what this is. But it's like, also kind of, there's a little bit of like magic in it. And I had just come from reading all of these World War II, Holocaust books, very deep historical books. And then I'm reading about this girl who has a girl appear in her closet who eats cakes. And I was just like, I don't know if it was because I came from such a heavy area and then I went into this and I was thinking it was going to be so fantastic. So I wrote this review and I was trying to stay respectful, but I just didn't understand. I think that's hard too when so many people like it and you didn't. I wanted to like it. I wanted to feel what everybody else was feeling and I just didn't. So it kind of made me sad.
I absolutely know. Here's a hot take for you. People are going to come for me in the comments.
Oh no.
I don't like The Great Gatsby.
Oh.
At all.
Classic.
I know. And people love it. Like, they love it. And I'm like, this book is terrible. Now, I can tell you why I don't like it, but it's hard. It's hard to talk about it when you didn't enjoy it and everyone, like, it's like this overwhelming feeling of everyone likes this story. How do you not like this story? It's like saying you don't like Dr. Seuss or something. Like, this is un-American of you.
Right. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say they didn't like The Great Gatsby, unless they were in school and they had to read it and they're like, oh, this is so boring.
Right. It doesn't count if it was homework.
Exactly. But that's very interesting.
Yeah, and so I think that we all have these books where we're just like, this isn't a book I'm connecting to. Or sometimes it's a great book, and in my mind I know it's a great book, but if I can't connect to any of the characters, like if I don't care about a character, it's really hard for me to continue reading.
I think that's what happened to me in The Sugar Queen. I had zero connection to the characters. Yeah. I didn't care either way what happened to them. I wasn't rooting for them. I didn't feel their sadness or pain. I wasn't excited when they were excited or joyful. I felt nothing.
Yeah, and like that's not a pleasurable read.
No.
Like, you don't want to read a book if it feels like that. And sometimes books are just not the book right now. Mm-hmm. And so if you've just read a whole bunch of books that you really loved, or this happens to me, like I read a book that's a 5-star book, like it's the most amazing thing I've ever read. I know in my mind the next book I read, I'm not going to like.
It has a lot to live up to.
Yeah, and it's like I just can't get my mind out of that previous world. Mm-hmm. To really give it my all for this new book that I'm reading. And so I have to take that into consideration sometimes when I'm talking about a book or I'm writing a review, and it's like, well, no, I probably didn't give it a fair read. And I even have a shelf in my Goodreads where I keep track of books that are my not right now books. maybe finish later, I think is the name of the shelf.
Oh, okay.
And because I'll have started them and I'm like, I know I should enjoy this, but I don't enjoy this. So I should just put this down and read it later.
Right, that makes sense. Because if you're not enjoying it, why prolong the experience?
Exactly. There are so many books to read, and there's so little time to read them that
I know.
You should read something you love.
Yes. Well, I am so excited that we got to talk about how to talk about books. And I learned a lot, and I will be using those rules. And I think that's kind of what I needed, is almost like an outline. So I really like that you almost had like that outline or worksheet that you used in the beginning to kind of train your way of writing.
Yeah, and I'll take that outline and I'll put it in the show notes. So if anybody wants to see kind of what that looked like and then develop their own, they can kind of use that as a starting point. So I think it really helps just to give you some ideas.
Right. Maybe we could put that on our Facebook page too.
Yeah. Yes.
That would be great.
We'll get it posted out there for you guys. So if you guys want to check it out.
Awesome. Well, it was nice talking to you guys again, and we will see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed hanging out with us.
Don't forget to check us out on social media and subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss out on any of the fun.
See you next week.